recap a little on f-stops. F-stops are the unit of aperture, the amount of light intensity that enters the camera obscura, or how bright the image appears inside the camera. The wider open aperture, the brighter or more intense the image appears on the film plane. F-stops also control depth of field, and that provides photographers with greater control over the image design or image result. The term field is used to describe the space within the subject domain, that is, the area or field where the subjects are located outside the camera. There is a distinction between subject space, the field where the subjects are located outside the camera, and image space, which is the area where the image is formed inside the camera. Depth of field deals with that space outside the camera and where the subject is located. So let's deconstruct this simplistic image to describe what depth of field is. The subjects in this image, which comprise of a chef in the foreground, a group of chefs in the middle ground, and a chef in the background, are all focused, or the entire image is sharp. We would describe this image as having a large or deep depth of field, that is, if it was actually a photograph. The depth of field in this image extends across the subject space within this distance. In this diagram, the image has changed significantly. The chefs in the foreground and the background are now out of focus, while the group of chefs in the middle ground remain sharp or remain in focus. How can this image be so different? Because different depth of field parameters have been used to change or control the results of how much sharpness appears in the subject space. In this instance, we would describe the image as having a shallow depth of field. The depth of field would only extend around the middle ground and not into the foreground and background spaces. As you can see by the size of the line, the area that appears sharp is reduced, or there is a smaller depth of field. Okay, now what has happened in this image? The foreground is now in focus while the middle and background areas appear unsharp. We have shifted this zone of focus or depth of field to the foreground, and everything behind the foreground subject is now fuzzy or soft. We can see the amount of focus remains similar to the previous image. However, we have now changed the emphasis of the image. The foreground chef is the dominant centre of interest, while the rest are less important. By controlling depth of field, we can apply image design concepts and control how and what we want to dominate the attention. In this instance, the chef in the foreground is isolated from the background using shallow depth of field. A very neat trick. So let's define this concept. Depth of field is the area within the subject space that records an acceptable degree of sharpness. We saw how the areas of acceptable sharpness appeared in the diagrammatic examples. However, does this actually apply in real photographs? The answer is yes, of course. These actual photographs display the exact same visual effect as the previous diagrams. The image on the left of the screen is displaying a shallow depth of field with only a single figure in sharp focus, while the other image display all four figures sharp. So depth of field is a concept that affects the sharpness within certain zones situated within the subject space. So how do we control this effect? Essentially by f-stop selection. Although there are some other factors affecting depth of field, and we will also discuss those factors later in this lecture. The image on the left was shot at f2.8, while the image on the right, f32. We can see that the f32 image has all the figures sharp, while the f2.8, the degree of sharpness, is isolated to the single figure with the painted red head. So smaller apertures or larger f-stop numbers produce greater depth of field than larger apertures or smaller f-stops. While we now know how to alter the depth of field through the f-stop selection, what are the creative considerations for selecting different depths of field? This lecture will explain and deconstruct some images in relation to depth of field. We will also discuss how to control this fabulous creative tool. We can clearly see the effect of depth of field with this portrait image. The background displays a less degree of sharpness than the centre of interest, the subject in the foreground. The depth of field in this image allows greater separation between the subject and the background. The background provides a good base for the image without overpowering or drawing the attention of the viewer. The depth of field is also visible in this Stephen Shaw image. The subject standing in the pool steps, the ripples on the water, and the second handrail are all in focus. However, the rail in the foreground and the area situated at the side of the pool and behind the subject are out of focus. There are clear delineations between sharp and unsharp areas within the field in both these images. Shallow depth of field is a common technique used to either isolate subjects and increase their level of interest or dominance, and for aesthetic reasons within the image design. Shallow depth of field is controlled by wider open apertures and in some other instances, camera movements. While shooting people in crowds or busy scenes and backgrounds, the centre of interest or the subject can often be ambiguous within the busy scene. This diagram highlights this effect. The centre of interest in the foreground becomes confused and blends into the background crowd. The centre of interest within the image design is unclear. This diagram applies the concept of shallow depth of field, and now the foreground subject is clearly the dominant centre of interest. The context of the crowded scene is not lost by using this method. However, there is certainly some degree of isolation between the foreground and background subjects. This image by Annie Leibovitz illustrates this concept very well. The background is significantly out of focus and the subject sharp. The design of the image is very strong. The selective focus or shallow depth of field isolates the subject from the background. Tone, shape and line are important elements in this image design. This image by Graham Nash is an excellent example of how selective focus with a shallow depth of field is used creatively. The repetition of the same subject caused by reflection produces a tension that raises the interest level in the image. The conflicting direction of the gaze also adds an interesting dimension, one focused directly at the viewer, while the other from the same subject is an averted gaze. The contrast of gaze creates tension to the narrative. One gaze is confronting the viewer, the other subservient, which is generally impossible from the same subject at the same time. This conundrum adds tension and interest to the image. Allowing the reflected image to be sharp and the background out of focus provides a clear direction towards which gaze the image the photographer wants the viewer to consider. They are both reflected images as well. This is probably the best known William Klein image. In this image, the foreground is out of focus while the two boys are sharp. This is an important application of selective focus because the attention is drawn away from the toy gun and the boy's expression is the unambiguous centre of interest. The toy gun is still an important element in the image design. However, it does not dominate because it's unsharp against a sharp background. In this image by Rodney Smith, the depth of field is clearly visible by looking at the wheat crop. The only section that is sharp is where the centre of interest is located. The wheat crop also produces an interesting texture that is out of focus. An interesting image by Irvin Penn, with the image repeated within the glass bottle. Importantly, the image design places the background image of the figure out of focus to increase the interest in the bottle. Selective focus with a shallow depth of field is often used in food photography. This image by Tim Eubanks shows how this technique is used within this specialised genre of commercial photography. Selective focus is not only used in this case to isolate the subject, like it does in most other applications, and while there remains some application to drawing the attention to the viewer to the important component of the image, the food, there is another reason for this technique. Food photography is very much about the graphic quality of the image and incorporates sophisticated food styling to enhance the design concepts. However, there's another important element, that is the concept of food appearing appetizing. Eliciting other senses like taste from a purely visual medium like photography raises interesting challenges for the food photographer. There are lots of tricks we can use to enhance the concept of taste or yumminess, and selective focus using a shallow depth of field produces a certain aesthetic to the image, which does enhance the concept of taste. What is this image about? Firstly, the shallow depth of field is clearly visible in this image, and if you answered the image is a diorama or a model, you would be completely wrong. This image by Greg Keane is actually taken from a real-life situation, and the application of shallow depth of field makes it appear like a model rather than real life. The look or aesthetic created by this technique is referred to as fake model photography. It is achieved by a wide-open aperture and applying camera movements with tilt and shift lenses to alter the plane of sharp focus. Photoshop can also be used to create this look. However, optically produced unsharpness through tilt and shift lenses offers a slightly different look to Photoshop blurring. Nevertheless, an interesting result when using depth of field. Deep depth of field is when the depth of field essentially covers all the field space in the image. This simply means that all subjects appear sharp. Deep depth of field is established by using smaller apertures or larger f-stop numbers. Edward Weston's image illustrates deep depth of field. Everything in the image is sharp. Weston was a member of the F-64 group, which was a group of American West Coast photographers who commonly used F-64 or essentially small apertures, or the smallest aperture. You may be thinking, how do you use F-64 because your digital SLR camera has a minimum aperture of only f/22. The F-64 group used large format cameras, and the range of aperture changes with different camera formats. The F-64 group used this f-stop because it produced a deep depth of field, but more specifically overall sharpness. The group's work was also a response against pictorialist images, which depicted soft or blurred images as a way to gain photographic work as accepted as art. However, the F-64 group moved photography into a modernist concept, where images were produced using the highest technology of the day, and the images displayed a high degree of technical competence. It was a celebration of the technology. This meant large format cameras, quality optics, and smaller f-stops to get pin-sharp images with everything sharp. This image is a great example of this modernist aesthetic, with everything in the image sharp by way of deep depth of field and assisting in celebrating technological advances. This is a contemporary example of deep depth of field and achieving overall sharpness of all the contents in the frame. Brett Weston is Edward Weston's son. This landscape image displays the concept of deep depth of field. Note the foreground items are also sharp, which requires some careful consideration of the depth of field, and Weston most likely used a hyperfocal distance method. This portrait depicts both subjects completely sharp using deep depth of field. Both subjects are equally important in this composition, and a strong unity between them exists. Contemporary commercial photography or product photography regularly uses deep depth of field methods, so the product is completely sharp. The modernist concept certainly applies to commercial photography too. Arnold Newman's portrait also displays the concept of deep depth of field. The background is quite important in this environmental portrait and image design. The background and foreground works in combination with the subject and adds meaning to the image. The essence or aesthetic created by Marco Grob in this portrait of Alice Cooper is enhanced by the level of sharpness and detail. This aesthetic is created in combination with, firstly, a deep depth of field to record everything sharp through the camera, lighting quality, and post-production sharpening. It produces a very contemporary aesthetic to portraiture. Benet's image also displays a deep depth of field. This image has such a simplistic yet highly sophisticated image design. It's simple because there are very few elements, the field comprising of the landscape or the hills, the structure and the sky. That's it. It is sophisticated because of, one, the simplistic design, and two, the placement of the structure in the rule of thirds, and three, framing and balance between the sky, horizon, field and structure. Framing the camera isn't just pointing the camera. It is how you see the image and consider composition. Someone who I can't remember once said, great framing in composing photographs is about inches. There is often only small degrees of differences in the distance between a poor image and a great one. Make sure framing is a highly considered aspect of your practice. It makes a huge difference to the results. So let's examine the factors influencing depth of field. The most significant factor is the aperture or f-stop selection. This series of images demonstrates the effect of f-stop with depth of field. If you look at the G key, this is approximately where the camera was focused and appears sharp in all images. The other two keys to examine in each shot are the C and O keys situated in the foreground and background. The F2 image shows the C and O keys to be quite out of focus because F2 produces less depth of field. You can actually see the very narrow area of sharp focus within this image. There is some progressive increase of sharpness or depth of field for the f5.6 and f11 images, while the f22 image displays a greater depth of field and all keys are in sharp focus. Comparing the two extremes illustrates a significant difference caused by the f-stop selection. Another factor affecting depth of field is the focal length of the lens. Longer focal length lenses have less depth of field than shorter focal length lenses. Another way to consider this is wide-angle lenses have greater depth of field than telephotos. These two images demonstrate this concept. The image on the left was taken with a 200mm lens at f2.8. The other was shot using a 16mm lens using the same f-stop and camera distance remained the same. I had to crop the 16mm image to match the 200mm image in size. While the 16mm lens image has a lot more noise caused by severe cropping to make this comparison, the background has a significantly greater degree of sharpness. If you examine the depth of field scales from a wide-angle lens and a telephoto lens, you will also notice the difference of spread across the distance scales. Knowing this fact can also help with your image management. If a deep depth of field is required, like landscape shots, then a wide-angle lens at smaller apertures may be a better option. Most landscape images are shot with wide-angle lenses. If a shallow depth of field is needed in sports photography to isolate the sportsperson from the crowd, longer lenses with a wide-open aperture can be the lens to use. The speed of longer lenses are important in this situation. However, we'll discuss lens speed at another time. U-distance is another factor affecting depth of field. U-distance, as expressed in the lens equation, is the distance between the camera lens and the subject. Shorter U-distances produce less depth of field. Because macro photography involves getting close to the subject, the shorter U-distance produces significant problems and the ability of getting enough depth of field, even at small apertures. Camera movements are more complex for this intro lecture. However, certain cameras and lenses, like shift and tilt lenses, allow the plane of focus to be altered. There are a range of movements you can apply, and these movements can increase or decrease the effect of depth of field. We previously examined an image that was described as fake model photography. Camera movements can assist in this effect and can also be applied in post-production. Camera format, which is the size of the gate or sensor, also has an influence on depth of field. Larger format photography like 5x4 or 10x8 inch has significantly less depth of field than 35mm or digital SLR photography. The smaller camera formats produce greater depth of field. This fact can become problematic when you're using very small format digital cameras like mobile phones or point-and-shoot portable digital cameras. This situation helps most types of small format photography from an amateur perspective, that is, the ability to get the subject in focus. However, if you are trying to isolate a portrait subject from the background, it is almost impossible with these digital cameras with such a small sensor. The depth of field is usually too great to get a shallow depth of field. Hyperfocal distance is the ability to increase the depth of field by using a hypothetical focus distance. However, we will discuss this in greater detail further into the lecture. Exposure conditions often restrict the ability to use smaller apertures and therefore indirectly affect depth of field, especially in low light conditions where smaller apertures are very difficult. So let's look at a few facts about depth of field and examine methods on how we can measure or determine the actual depth of field our camera can produce. In general or gross photography, depth of field works in a ratio of 1/3 in front of the focus plane and 2/3 behind. In close-up or macro photography, the ratio is closer to 50-50. However, in most applications, depth of field works in this 1/3 to 2/3 ratio. This image we saw earlier illustrates this concept. What is important to understand is if you are shooting, say, a group of people configured like a team photograph with 4 rows of people, which row do you focus the camera on? The answer is the second row due to this 1/3 to 2/3 ratio. In this shot I did exactly that. I focused on the second figure so that when I stop down the aperture, the ratio of 1/3 to 2/3 allow the figures to be sharp. If I focused on the first figure, this would result in empty or wasted depth of field in the foreground, the 1/3 in front. And the last figure may not fall into the depth of field zone, resulting in an unsharp last figure. So understanding how the ratio works is important when critical depth of field results need to be considered. Depth of field works in a 1/3 to 2/3 ratio in most general photography. There are several methods for determining the amount of depth of field your camera will produce prior to taking the shot. Relying on the image in the small camera screen is not a very successful way to evaluate depth of field. The first method is by using your instincts or your gut feeling. In shallow depth of field shots for portraits is fairly simple. You know by selecting a wider open aperture the background will fall outside the zone of focus. However, when shooting subjects with deeper depth of field or making sure that your subjects are covered within the critical zone of sharp focus, determining the depth of field becomes more critical. There are several methods you can use, including depth of field scales, preview buttons, auto depth of field functions, and hyperfocal distance. Several digital SLR cameras have a special function that will, in combination with the autofocus system, measure the foreground and background distances and automatically set the required depth of field. I'm a bit old school and prefer to deal with depth of field manually, and I cannot comment on whether these auto systems work well or not. I've never used auto depth of field. I am, however, making you aware this function is possible with some cameras, and you should consult your camera manual for further details. Depth of field scales are located on the lens next to the distance scale. This is an older lens, but you can see on this lens all the necessary components used for determining depth of field. Firstly, there is the actual f-stop located on the lens. The lens focus distance, which is the distance the focus plane is from the camera, or U distance, and the depth of field scale. On the depth of field scale, you can see a range of paired f-stops either side of the focus distance indicator. We will use this setting as an example to explain how depth of field scales can work. Firstly, the f-stop selected is f22. Secondly, the camera is focused on the subject at around 0.44 meters from the camera, using the focus distance scale. Lastly, the depth of field for this shot is between 0.3 of a meter to 1 meter at f22. By reading both f22s on the depth of field scale, the distance scale indicates depth of field. You can also notice that the larger or wider apertures, or smaller f-stop numbers, have less depth of field using this depth of field scale. Depth of field scales are very easy to use and very handy. This scale is also a very large scale because it is a wide angle lens, or a 20mm focal length lens. Remember, wide angle or short focal length lenses have a greater depth of field. This is the depth of field scale on a more modern lens. The depth of field and distance scales are both shown. This is actually a 50mm lens, and you may have noticed that there is a shorter spread of the f-stop values and even less f-stops indicated on the scale, only f16 and f32. For those who may be wondering what the red dot is, this is the focus shift when using infrared photography, but more about that in another lecture. Another way to determine the depth of field is to use the depth of field preview button. The selected f-stop is only applied within the lens when we press the shutter and the camera is actually taking the photograph. When the camera is not taking the photograph, the lens aperture is automatically open to its widest aperture. This allows more light to enter into the camera's viewfinder, resulting in a brighter image for photographers to compose and focus more accurately. While the brighter screens may make it easier to focus, they only allow us to see the depth of field at the widest aperture and not the f-stop we may have selected on the camera. The depth of field preview, however, allows the lens to be stopped down to the f-stop you have selected on the camera and allows you to visually see the depth of field, or to see the important areas within the subject remaining sharp. The preview button is usually located within the front of the camera body, and it certainly is with camera digital SLRs. It is a quick and easy way of checking to make sure you have sufficient depth of field, particularly when you're shooting deep depth of field concepts. One issue, however, because you are physically closing down the aperture in the lens, the viewfinder screen becomes considerably darker and is more difficult to see the image, especially when you're using the minimum aperture. Try to locate this function on your camera and have a play with different f-stops and try to visualize the depth of field through the preview button. Hyperfocal distance method allows an increase in foreground depth of field by using the depth of field scale. A common distance when using wide-angle lenses is infinity, especially with landscape work. This setting we can see on the screen with the lens is a common landscape photography set. The lens is a 20mm lens, focal length lens, and the focus distance is infinity, that inverted 8. Using the depth of field scale, we have the depth of field between 0.7 meters to infinity. However, we have already discovered that depth of field scale works on both sides of the focus distance, and effectively this area, or this side of the scale, is wasted because it does not change. Infinity is infinity. By simply moving the infinity symbol to the right and in line with the f-stop used in the exposure, in this case f22, further foreground distances move into the sharp zone or indicated depth of field. This technique increases the depth of field from 0.7 meters to infinity to 0.3 meters to infinity. In landscape photography, this can greatly improve the foreground sharpness, which is often critical with this type of work. So what you get with the hyperfocal distance method is an increase of foreground sharpness using your depth of field scale. What you have to get used to though is by applying the focal distance, when you look through the viewfinder, the image looks unsharp. It's about trusting the depth of field scale, because remember the lens is wide open for viewing and you have shifted the focus from or off the infinity distance, which is the actual subject distance. So when you look through the camera, it may appear unfocused. So let's summarize some of the key points of this lecture. Depth of field is the zone within the subject space that produces sharp focus. It is mostly controlled by f-stop selection. However, there are other considerations like focal length of the lens, U distance, camera format, camera movements, etc. Smaller apertures or larger f-stops offer greater depth of field. Larger apertures or smaller f-stop numbers offers less depth of field. Depth of field plays an important role in managing image design and the control over shallow or deep depth of field. Now that we have covered concepts like exposure, depth of field, and subject movement, let's examine how this works holistically and offers several options within the creativity of making photographs. Which settings should we apply? What this diagram is designed to illustrate is the nexus between concepts regarding the law of reciprocity for exposure and the visual options or creativity each setting has to offer. This diagram represents one single exposure, meaning within a given level of illumination and a certain film speed, the range of exposures seen here are all equivalent. This is what the law of reciprocity suggests in exposure. Each of the exposure combinations, like f5.6 at 1/15th of a second, are equal in exposure value. The range of f-stops from left to right are halved and produce high levels of light intensity with wide open apertures to low intensities of light with the smaller openings, while the shutter duration or time is doubled from left to right, going from short durations to longer duration shutter speeds. The law of reciprocity suggests that all these exposures are equal. However, while they may have an equivalent exposure value, do they offer the same result visually? Now that we know about subject movement caused by changing the shutter speed and depth of field caused by changing the aperture, an examination of this diagram reveals significant differences in the depth of field and movement. Actually, what this diagram offers is a range of visual choices for the photographer and an increased level of creativity. This version of the diagram shows the creative options for each of the exposure parameters. Within the f-stop selection, there are variations of depth of field, while in the shutter speeds offer variations in subject movement. We have, as photographers, through the law of reciprocity, the option to change one parameter, adjust the other, and the visual result can be significantly different. Understanding this process is critical for creative control over your photographs. It is the fundamental difference between using equipment that allows you more creative control than just point and shoot.